This footage you're seeing on your screen shows massive bombs being detonated near the newly invented USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier. Take a guess on who was behind this detonation. Is it the Iranian forces? Is it the Chinese Navy? Is it the Yemeni Houthis? Nope, none of the above. The guys behind this violent bombing of the American giant vessel are none other than the Americans themselves. Now you might be wondering, why on earth would the United States Navy use a 40,000-pound explosive on a $13 billion aircraft carrier? And it's considered the largest and most expensive carrier to date, especially if you realize that there are around 3,000 sailors aboard the vessel during these bombings. Has the US Navy gone crazy? Or are they celebrating the 4th of July in a new fashion? All of this can be explained simply with two words: shock trials. You might have heard this term before on news outlets. Maybe you've seen footage of bombs going off near American aircraft carriers. Shock trials or shock tests are a very rare occurrence in the US Navy, especially when conducted on aircraft carriers. In this video, we're going to see what shock trials are, the reasoning behind why the US Navy uses them, and we're going to highlight the strategic significance they hold. And at the end, we'll take a look at some of the controversies they can spark. Shock trials, to put it simply, are a series of rigorous tests designed to assess a ship's ability to withstand the effects of underwater explosions, particularly those caused by enemy mines or torpedoes. During these tests, the Navy intentionally detonates explosive charges near the ship to simulate the impact of an underwater explosion. The ship's response to these blasts is carefully monitored. The design of the whole vessel gets to be put on the line as the Navy closely takes a look at things like the hull, the equipment, the systems, etc. All of the data that gets collected from these trials helps engineers and naval architects understand how the aircraft carrier behaves under extreme conditions and identify any vulnerabilities or weaknesses that need to be addressed. Shock trials are typically conducted on newly constructed vessels or after significant upgrades or modifications to existing ones. Now, usually, crew members of the US Navy don't get to be on board vessels during these bombing tests, for safety reasons obviously. But in recent years, during the series of the shock trials that were done on the newly built USS Gerald R. Ford, the United States Navy wanted to flex its muscles and show the whole world that this aircraft carrier is capable of withstanding the harsh climates of war while keeping its crew members safe. During the rigorous and unusual testing phase, which included about 3,000 to 4,000 crew members on board, big detonations happened involving a massive 40,000-pound explosive power adjacent to the starboard side of the Ford vessel. As you can imagine, the intensity of the explosion was so profound that it reverberated with a forceful impact, registering at an astonishing 3.9 on the Richter scale, which is a measurement typically associated with seismic events like earthquakes. Despite all of that, the powerful aircraft carrier managed to withstand all of these explosions, which meant that she was finally ready for real battle scenarios. Shock trials or shock tests aren't a new thing after all. The history of shock tests on American aircraft carriers is a fascinating journey that spans decades of technological advancements and naval innovation. Dating back to the mid-20th century, shock testing became a crucial aspect of ensuring the durability and survivability of these massive vessels in the face of potential combat scenarios. Let's take a look at some examples from US naval history. During World War II, the United States Navy recognized the importance of testing aircraft carriers under simulated combat conditions. The simulation worked wonders. It helped to assess the ability of the vessels to withstand the impact of explosions and other forms of shock. One of the earliest documented instances of shock trials occurred with the USS Saratoga in 1946, when the ship was subjected to controlled blasts to evaluate its structural integrity. The USS Saratoga CV-3 was a Lexington-class aircraft carrier that was blasted by the sheer might of nuclear explosives. During the year 1946, the Saratoga was a target for nuclear weapon tests during Operation Crossroads. This operation was infamous and well talked about. Let's just say that. It consisted of a pair of atomic bomb test explosions. The first one detonated above the ship, after failing from a B-29 Superfortress Dave's Dream. It was considered an unsuccessful test because the explosion kind of missed the target. Second bomb detonated underwater and it actually managed to fully sink the USS Saratoga. That's not surprising considering each of the bombs generated a whopping yield of 23 kiloton. To put that in perspective, the Hiroshima bomb dropped on Japan had 16 kiloton yield. Granted, the ship didn't have sailors aboard during these two shock trials, as you can imagine. The incident not only was famous for the humongous nuclear explosives used, the controversial damage and pollution it caused to the location of the detonation, the Bikini Atoll Island, but also it was amongst the reasons that sparked the idea for Godzilla, as a matter of fact. The US Navy also did some shock testing on other aircraft carriers like the formidable Nimitz-class aircraft carriers, specifically the USS Theodore Roosevelt CVN-71. The latter was the last vessel to be tested that way in 1987 prior to the shock trials that were conducted on the Gerald R. Ford. These trials aimed to subject the American vessels to intense explosions, and the data that was collected from these trials served as a cornerstone for future analysis, serving as a bedrock upon which the US Navy could build a more powerful, more advanced aircraft carrier. Hence, we have the Gerald R. Ford today. Speaking of which, the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier was subjected to 3 major shock trials in the middle of 2021, about 100 miles off the coast of Florida. The first test was done on the 18th of June, the second was done on the 16th of July, and the third was done on the 8th of August of that year. These tests involved a meticulous procedure designed to evaluate the ship's ability to withstand the effects of underwater explosions and other forms of shock. Prior to conducting these 3 shock trials, extensive planning and preparation were probably undertaken to ensure the safety of personnel and the integrity of the ship. The procedures of conducting a test like this typically begins with the establishments of objectives and parameters, which may include determining the ship's vulnerability to various explosive threats and assessing the effectiveness of its structural design and protective measures. Once the objectives are defined, the Navy puts a detailed test plan outlining the specific scenarios, explosives, and instrumentation to be used during the trials. Before conducting the actual shock tests, Gerald R. Ford underwent a comprehensive assessment to verify its readiness and suitability for testing. There was the conducting pre-shock inspections, the reinforcing of vulnerable areas, and the installations of the various instrumentations to record data during the trials. During the 3 tests, 40,000-pound explosive charges were strategically towed by a boat moving behind the big vessel at predetermined distances and detonated to simulate the effects of underwater explosions. The Navy didn't clarify the exact distance between the explosion and the aircraft carrier, as this info remained top secret. Nevertheless, the ship's response to the shock waves was closely monitored using a variety of sensors and instrumentation, including accelerometers, strain gauges, and high-speed cameras. Data collected during the trials was analyzed in real time to assess the ship's performance and identify any areas of concern. Fun fact, the third test involved a blast registered at a 3.9 magnitude earthquake. This magnitude is normally capable of cracking windows and even walls of buildings. However, the ship's commanding officer said that the blast did less damage to the Gerald R. Ford than they actually predicted at first. And most shocking of all about these shock tests is that for the first time ever, the US Navy put full deck crew members on board the ship during the bombings. That meant that we got actual statements coming directly from sailors describing what it feels like to have your vessel getting attacked. 2 sailors from the USS Gerald R. Ford shared their insights with Insider regarding their participation to the recent shock trials, providing perspectives from both the ship's bridge and below deck. Lieutenant Commander Greg Sutter, serving as the Assistant Navigation Officer and officer of the deck throughout the testing, was stationed on the bridge, situated approximately 100 feet or about 30 meters above the waterline. Meanwhile, Electrician's Mate Second Class John Dacanay was positioned in the repair locker situated at the waterline level. From his vantage point on the bridge, Sutter observed the impactful explosion, the billowing smoke, and the formation of a sizable wave. As the test ensued, he detected an odor reminiscent of gunpowder. Sutter said, "There was an eerie feeling as we counted down the last few seconds, knowing it was about to go off. Then the ship started rattling and shaking. I couldn't say it was as much as a car accident or anything, but you could definitely feel the thump of it hitting you." Meanwhile, Dacanay, who was positioned within a repair locker on the second deck, recounted hearing a discernible loud bang despite wearing hearing protection. He said, "It shocked me quite a bit. You are able to feel the vibration throughout the ship and the rocking of the waves." This is a very interesting perspective coming from 2 sailors who were on board the Gerald R. Ford during the shock trials. The rattling of the carrier from the initial blast and the aftershocks lasted for about 10 to 15 seconds. This sensation is relatively uncommon for sailors aboard carriers. Aircraft carriers such as the Ford boast lengths of nearly 1,100 feet or 300 meters and navigate through most seas with minimal rolling. The bridge team of the ship usually rotates duties cautiously and selects courses that reduce the ship's pitch and roll, acknowledging that sudden movements could potentially harm planes and endanger crew members. The resulting consequence of these tests were minor injuries to some of the sailors on board and some damage done to the ship. Rear Admiral Jim Downey, the program executive officer for aircraft carriers, indicated that initially the Navy anticipated a more extensive maintenance period following a series of live blasts during the shock trials. These assumptions were drawn from the experience of the last carrier shock trial in 1987, involving the Nimitz carrier-class Theodore Roosevelt. Most of the items on the ship that broke were not items apparently required to be shock-hardened. The Navy chose not to disclose further details regarding the explosives configuration used in the trials, its distance from the ship during detonation, or the rationale behind selecting the specific yield. The only thing they clarified is that they were conducting shock trials on new ship designs, the Gerald Ford class, using live explosives to ensure that warships can effectively fulfill mission requirements even under adverse battlefield conditions. These tests without a doubt highlighted the leadership and crew's demonstration of Navy readiness by persevering through the shock, affirming the ship's capability to withstand impacts and sustain its mission. This has been the first mission in about 34 years where the U.S. Navy blew up an aircraft carrier to test its capabilities. The 3 shock tests conducted on the Gerald R. Ford carrier not only served to evaluate the ship's resilience and readiness, but also showcased the formidable strength of the U.S. Navy on the global stage. These tests were crucial milestones as they demonstrated the Navy's commitment to ensuring that its warships can withstand the rigors and harshness of modern warfare. By subjecting the carrier to explosive blasts, the Navy aimed to validate its ability to endure harsh combat conditions, thereby bolstering confidence in its capabilities. Moreover, these trials were not just about testing a vessel. They also symbolized the broader message of U.S. military prowess and deterrence against potential adversaries like China. As tensions rise in various strategic theaters, such as the South China Sea, showcasing this sophisticated vessel's capabilities sends a clear signal that describes American strength and resolve. The U.S. aims to assert its dominance in naval warfare and project power across the world's oceans. Through these tests, the U.S. underscores the significance of its newly developed aircraft carrier class, solidifying its position as a preeminent maritime power and ensuring its ability to defend its interests and allies effectively. Moreover, placing full members of the crew on board the huge 100,000-ton aircraft carrier during these shock trials sent waves of encouragement and morale boosters to the whole American Navy sailors, as this milestone in engineering made sure that the Gerald R. Ford class is capable of keeping its sailors and its equipment safe during battles. The nuclear-powered carrier demonstrated that she is capable of surviving attacks and explosions similar to the effects of submarine attacks, naval mines, and more. These tests also made sure that the crew on board were well-trained and well-knowledgeable of what to do in case of a real-life attack. Following the explosion, the crew swiftly initiated damage control protocols, meticulously scouring the vessel for any indications of potential flooding or fires. They carefully inspected both combat and ship systems, diligently ensuring that any components that may have been compromised or rendered temporarily inoperative are promptly restored to full functionality. This process served to maintain the operational readiness of the ship and uphold its combat effectiveness in the face of adversity. Helicopters were able to land on the deck within mere minutes of the blast, which showcased that the Gerald R. Ford carrier is able to make fast emergency responses, even during enemy attacks. This immediate deployment showed us the ship's resilience and continued readiness to engage in combat operations, despite the recent disruptive event. The shock tests that were done 3 years ago are a very rare occurrence for obvious reasons. Amongst the risk are getting vessels worth billions of dollars destroyed, the cost that comes with long procedures like shock trials, and also the harm it could cause to maritime life. Keep in mind, these tests aren't just fireworks. They are massive bombs used in war, and they're being detonated in the ocean, a place where millions of creatures live. It's very unwise to look past the fact that the shock test done by the American Navy can cause some serious harm to marine life. Michael Jasny, the director of the Natural Resources Defense Council's Marine Mammal Protection Project, said that according to the Navy's modeling, it is anticipated that certain smaller species of marine mammals could have perished within the range of 1 to 2 kilometers from the explosion. And some marine mammal species may have experienced injuries, such as hearing impairment, extending up to 10 kilometers from the blast site. It's important to know that the area is home to populations of dolphins and small whales at this time of year. Jasny explained that a large whale might need to be within a few hundred meters of the blast to die, while a small mammal could be a couple of kilometers away. And even if these creatures die, the loss of hearing is a significant problem for mammals who make their living in the ocean, and they use their hearing to find food and find each other. Meanwhile, a spokesperson for the USS Gerald Ford told Defense News that the test took place within a narrow schedule that complies with environmental mitigation requirements, respecting known migration patterns of marine life in the test area. The Navy explained that before each test, the FSST team issued warnings to mariners to steer clear of the test area and meticulously implemented safety protocols to safeguard both military and civilian personnel involved in the operation. A dedicated group comprising over a dozen scientists, biologists, and observers were stationed aboard the USS Ford, as well as on nearby support vessels and observation aircraft. Equipped with powerful lenses, these observers scanned the ocean for marine life from considerable distances, even amidst challenging conditions like ocean waves and white caps. The U.S. Navy claimed that they made sure to respect protocols and keep the migration patterns of these marine animals in mind. However, if we go back to 1946, the nuclear shock trials conducted on Bikini Atoll resulted in profound environmental devastation, leaving a lasting legacy of pollution and ecological harm. The detonation of nuclear bombs on the pristine island not only obliterated its natural landscapes, but also unleashed a wave of radioactive contamination across the surrounding waters and airspace. The fallout from these tests contaminated the soil, water, and marine life, causing widespread ecological damage and posing significant health risks to both humans and wildlife. Decades later, Bikini Atoll remains uninhabitable. It's safe to say that the US is willing to keep detonating bombs on the ocean every year for testing reasons. In this regard, Jasny said that these detonations are of a power sufficient to kill marine mammals. The balance between military necessities and environmental conservation is a delicate one. From the perspective of the US, it needed to test out its newly made aircraft carrier class. But it's important that we all ensure no pollution and no harm is left in the oceans at the end of the day. With great power comes great responsibility after all. And with that, we conclude our story for today. Hopefully you enjoyed this video and learned with us a lot about why the US blows up its aircraft carriers. Please make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content like this.